They said she would die in chains. They said she would never escape. They said her promise was a delirious rambling of a broken woman. But Sarah Matthews proved them all catastrophically wrong. This is a story of 3 beatings that should have destroyed her, 3 escapes that should have been impossible, and 1 promise that changed everything. A promise made under the whip in 1856 Georgia that would take 6 years to fulfill, but would be fulfilled in the most unexpected and powerful way imaginable. My name is Sarah Matthews, and the first time James Whitfield nearly killed me, I was 28 years old and had been enslaved on Riverside Plantation for 8 years. It was March 1856, and I had just made the mistake that would lead to my first beating, my first escape, and the beginning of a journey that would end with me owning the very plantation where I had been tortured. Riverside Plantation sat along the Savannah River in eastern Georgia, 30 miles from the city of Savannah itself. 5,000 acres of cotton fields, 200 enslaved people, and a Greek Revival mansion that James Whitfield had built in 1848 when he inherited the property from his father. The house was his pride, filled with expensive furniture, crystal chandeliers, and porcelain imported from England and France. I worked in that house as a domestic servant, one of 12 enslaved people who maintained the interior, served meals, and catered to the Whitfield family's every need. It was considered better than field work, though better is relative when you're property either way. The housework kept me out of the brutal Georgia sun, but also kept me under constant supervision, under the watchful eyes of Mistress Catherine Whitfield and her husband James. The morning of March 15th, 1856, began like any other. I woke before dawn in the quarters, a row of wooden cabins behind the main house where the enslaved people lived. My son Daniel, 10 years old, still slept on the pallet we shared. He was small for his age, thin from inadequate food, but healthy enough. I kissed his forehead before leaving for the big house, as I did every morning, never knowing which morning might be my last with him. The Whitfields were hosting a dinner party that evening. Important guests from Savannah, and Mistress Catherine was in a state of anxious perfectionism. Every detail had to be flawless, every surface spotless, every piece of silver gleaming. I spent the morning polishing, cleaning, arranging, following her increasingly frantic instructions as she prepared for guests who would judge her household management skills based on the appearance of her home and behavior of her enslaved servants. The accident happened at 2 in the afternoon. I was carrying a tea service from the kitchen to the dining room, a silver tray with a complete set of English porcelain, cups and saucers, and a teapot that Mistress Catherine said cost more than I was worth. The tray was heavy. My arms were tired from hours of work, and as I turned the corner from the hallway into the dining room, I didn't see James Whitfield standing there. I collided with him. The tray flew from my hands. The porcelain exploded across the polished wooden floor in a cascade of white fragments and metallic crashes that echoed through the entire house. For a moment, there was absolute silence. I stood frozen, staring at the destruction, knowing what was coming but unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything but wait for the inevitable. James Whitfield's face turned red, then purple. He was 45 years old, a large man who had grown fat on plantation wealth, with thinning hair and small eyes that now fixed on me with murderous rage. "You clumsy worthless." He didn't finish the sentence. His hand swung and connected with my face. The impact so hard I fell to the floor among the broken porcelain. Blood filled my mouth. I tasted copper and felt a tooth loosen. But I knew better than to cry out, knew better than to show pain, knew that any reaction would only make it worse. "Do you know what that porcelain cost?" His voice was quiet now, which was more terrifying than shouting. "Do you have any idea what you just destroyed?" "Master, I'm sorry." My voice was barely a whisper. "It was an accident. I didn't see you. I'm so sorry." "An accident?" He laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "You've cost me $200 in porcelain. Do you know how I make enslaved servants understand the value of things?" I knew. Everyone on the plantation knew. James Whitfield was famous among Georgia planters for his brutal discipline, his belief that enslaved people only understood violence, his creative methods of punishment that left permanent scars, both physical and psychological. He grabbed my arm and dragged me from the dining room, through the house, out the back door. Mistress Catherine appeared in the hallway, took one look at the scene, and disappeared back into her parlor. She never intervened in her husband's punishments. No white woman did. The whipping post stood behind the house, a thick wooden pole set deep in the ground, with iron rings for restraints. I'd seen other enslaved people tied there, had heard their screams, had tended their wounds afterward, but I'd never been there myself. I'd been careful, obedient, invisible, until today. James ordered 2 of the field hands to tie me to the post. They did so with apologetic eyes, knowing they had no choice, knowing that refusing would put them in my place. My wrists were bound above my head, my dress torn open to expose my back. 20 lashes, James announced, for carelessness, for destroying valuable property, and for existing. The first strike of the whip tore through my back like fire. I bit my lip to keep from screaming, determined not to give him the satisfaction. The second strike crossed the first, creating an X of agony. By the 5th strike, I was screaming despite myself, unable to contain the pain that felt like my back was being flayed. By the 10th strike, I was barely conscious. By the 15th, I was praying for death. By the 20th, I was gone, slipped into a dark place where pain couldn't quite reach me. They cut me down and left me in the dirt. Someone I never learned who carried me back to my cabin in the quarters. I woke hours later to find Daniel crying beside me, his small hands trying to clean the blood from my shredded back. "Mama," he whispered. "Mama, please wake up. Please don't die." I wasn't going to die. Not yet. But lying there, feeling the fire across my back, listening to my son's terrified sobs, I made my first decision. I was going to escape. I was going to take Daniel and run. And we were going to be free or die trying, because dying in pursuit of freedom seemed better than living as property. 3 days later, my back still weeping blood to bandages, I made my move. It was March 18th, 1856, and I'd spent those 3 days planning, observing, preparing. I knew the plantation's routine, knew when the patrols changed, knew which routes through the swamp were least likely to be watched. I woke Daniel in the darkest part of the night, before even the roosters stirred. "We're leaving," I whispered. "We're going to be free." His eyes went wide with fear and hope. "Really, Mama? We can leave." "We can try, baby, but you have to be absolutely silent. Can you do that?" He nodded, and we slipped out of the cabin into the Georgia night. The moon was a thin crescent, barely providing light, which was both blessing and curse. We couldn't see well, but neither could anyone looking for us. I'd taken some cornmeal and dried meat, hidden in a cloth sack, along with a knife I'd stolen from the kitchen. Not much, but enough to keep us alive for a few days. I knew we had to get to the Savannah River, had to follow it north toward Augusta, had to find the people who helped enslaved people escape, the mysterious network that some whispered about. We made it 2 miles before Daniel started crying. His feet were cut and bleeding from the rough ground, his small body exhausted. I carried him, my back screaming in protest, every step agony but driven by desperation and hope. We spent the day hidden in a dense thicket of brush near the river, hungry and terrified, listening for pursuit. When night fell, we continued, moving slowly through terrain I didn't know, following the river north. The second day, we found a small cave where we rested. Daniel was feverish, his feet infected. I knew we needed medicine, but had no way to get it. We ate the last of our food and drank river water that tasted of mud and decay. On the 3rd day, March 21st, we heard the dogs. The sound was distant at first, then growing closer, the baying of bloodhounds trained to track escaped slaves. My heart turned to ice. I grabbed Daniel and ran, but his fever made him weak and my back made me slow. The dogs were faster. They found us at noon, 3 massive bloodhounds followed by 2 slave catchers on horseback. White men in wide-brimmed hats with rifles across their saddles and rope coiled at their sides. Professional hunters who made their living capturing human beings. Well, one of them said, looking down at me from his horse, "Sarah Matthews from Riverside, your master's been looking for you. There's a reward for your return. Alive is preferable, but dead is acceptable." I held Daniel close, knowing what was coming, knowing I'd failed, knowing that my attempt at freedom had just made everything worse. They tied my hands and forced me to walk behind their horses the entire 30 miles back to Riverside. Daniel rode with one of the catchers, crying for me the whole way. My feet bled. My back reopened. By the time we reached the plantation, I was barely conscious. James Whitfield was waiting, and he was smiling. "Sarah," he said pleasantly, "welcome home. I trust you've learned your lesson about the futility of escape." I said nothing. "No." "Well, perhaps this will teach you." The second beating was worse than the first. 50 lashes this time, administered in front of every enslaved person on the plantation, as an example. They tied Daniel to a post nearby, forced to watch his mother being destroyed. His screams were worse than my own. When it was over, when I lay broken in the dirt, James Whitfield leaned close and whispered, "Try that again, and I'll sell your boy. Do you understand? Run again, and you'll never see Daniel again." The threat was more effective than any whip. I understood, and I hated him more than I had thought it possible to hate another human being. But I also understood something else. I couldn't escape with Daniel. The boy slowed me down, made me vulnerable, gave Whitfield leverage. If I was going to be free, I would have to leave my son behind and come back for him later. The thought broke my heart, but it also hardened my resolve. I would escape again, and next time I would succeed. What do you think about Sarah's first attempt to escape? Would you have tried to run with your child, knowing it would make escape harder? Or would you have left him behind to come back later? Share your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your perspective on these impossible choices that enslaved people had to make. 6 months passed after my first escape attempt. 6 months during which I healed, planned, and watched my son grow thinner and sadder under the weight of plantation life. 6 months during which James Whitfield watched me constantly, suspicious of every move I made, convinced I would try to run again. He was right to be suspicious. But this time, I was more careful. It was September 1856, and the cotton harvest was in full swing. Everyone on the plantation was working from sunrise to well after sunset, picking cotton in the fields or processing it in the gin house. The activity created chaos, which created opportunity. I'd spent 6 months learning everything I could about the routes north, about the people who helped escapees, about the safe houses and signals. I gathered supplies slowly, a bit of food here, a piece of cloth there, nothing that would be noticed missing. I prepared myself mentally for what I knew I had to do. But then James Whitfield made the decision that changed everything. On September 12th, a slave trader came to Riverside. His name was Marcus Holland, and he specialized in purchasing young enslaved children to sell in the Deep South markets, where they commanded high prices from planters who wanted to train workers from a young age. I was in the kitchen when I heard James and the trader talking in the dining room, their voices carrying through the house. I froze, a knife in my hand, vegetables forgotten, as I listened to them negotiate. "I need to raise capital quickly," James was saying. "Bad cotton prices this year. I'm willing to sell some of my younger stock." "How young?" Holland's voice was businesslike, discussing human beings as if they were livestock. "I have several between 8 and 12 years old. Strong, healthy, good workers." My blood ran cold. Daniel was 10, exactly in that range. "Let me see them," Holland said. "I can offer good prices for the right specimens." I dropped the knife and ran, propriety and caution forgotten. I burst into the dining room, where the 2 white men sat with their cigars and whiskey. "Master Whitfield, please. Please don't sell my Daniel. Please, I'll do anything. Work harder. Never complain. Never try to escape again. Please." James looked at me with cold calculation. "Sarah, you're interrupting a private conversation. Please." I was crying now on my knees. "He's my only child. He's all I have. Please don't take him from me." "That's exactly why he's valuable," James said calmly. "You care about him. That gives me leverage. Besides, Holland here is offering an excellent price. Business is business, Sarah." "You can't." I was sobbing, clutching at his legs like a desperate animal. "Please, master. Please. I'm begging you." He kicked me away. "Enough. The decision is made. Holland will take 5 children, including your Daniel. Tomorrow morning, you should spend the night saying goodbye. The world ended in that moment. Everything I'd endured, every beating, every humiliation, every day of bondage, all it became bearable only because I had Daniel, my son, my reason for living. And James Whitfield was going to sell him to a trader who would take him to Mississippi or Alabama, somewhere I could never find him, never see him again. I spent that night holding Daniel, memorizing his face, telling him stories, trying to be strong even as my heart shattered into pieces. He cried and asked why, asked what he'd done wrong, asked if I would come get him someday. I promise, I whispered, knowing it was probably a lie, knowing I would likely never see him again. I promise I'll find you, baby. I promise. The next morning, September 13th, 1856, they came for Daniel. He screamed and fought, holding on to me with desperate strength, but the overseer pried him away. They loaded him and 4 other children into Holland's wagon, chained together like animals. The last thing I saw was Daniel's face in back of that wagon, tears streaming, calling for me as they drove away down the tree-lined road that led away from Riverside. Something broke in me in that moment, not my spirit, that hardened into something cold and sharp as steel. But something softer broke, some part of me that had still believed in humanity, that had still hoped for mercy, that had still thought that maybe the world had some justice in it. James Whitfield had taken my son from me, and I decided, standing there watching that wagon disappear, that I would take everything from him in return. But first, I had to escape. Again, I waited 2 weeks, letting James think I was broken, defeated, docile. I performed my duties with mechanical efficiency, spoke when spoken to, showed no emotion, no anger, no grief. I became invisible again, beneath notice. On September 27th, a massive thunderstorm rolled in from the Atlantic. Lightning split the sky. Thunder shook the house. Rain poured down in sheets, so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. It was perfect. At midnight, I slipped out of my cabin. The storm covered all sound, all movement. The patrols had taken shelter, unwilling to brave the weather. I was soaked within seconds, but I didn't care. I ran. This time, I didn't head for the river. I'd learned that lesson. Instead, I went east toward the coast, toward Savannah, where I'd heard there were free black communities, abolitionists, people who helped escapees. I ran all night through the storm, driven by rage and grief and desperate hope. By dawn, I'd covered maybe 15 miles, my feet torn and bleeding, my lungs burning, but still moving. I found an abandoned barn as the sun rose, collapsed in the hay loft, and slept the sleep of exhaustion. When I woke, it was late afternoon. I was starving, soaked, and starting to develop a fever. But I was 15 miles from Riverside, and I wasn't going back. I stayed in that barn for 6 days, hiding during the day, venturing out at night to steal eggs from chicken coops, vegetables from gardens, water from wells. I was careful, desperate, surviving on instinct and determination. On the 7th day, October 4th, 1856, my luck ran out. A farmer discovered me sleeping in his barn. He raised the alarm. Within hours, the same slave catchers who'd caught me before arrived with their dogs. They found me try to run through a field, tackle me, beat me for sport, and drag me back to Riverside. This time, James Whitfield was not smiling. He was furious, red-faced, trembling with rage that I had tried again despite his threats, despite the beating, despite taking my son. "You don't learn, do you, Sarah?" he said, circling me where I knelt in the dirt of the plantation yard. Every enslaved person had been summoned to watch. "You think you could defy me? You think you had any power here? You took my son," I said, my voice steady despite my terror. "You took my child and sold him like livestock. What else could you possibly take from me that would make me want to stay?" His face went darker. "Your life, Sarah. I can take your life. Would you like that?" "Yes," I said, and meant it. "Kill me, please. Because living here, knowing what you are, knowing what you've done, is worse than death." For a moment, I thought he would do it. I thought he would shoot me right there, and part of me welcomed it, welcomed an end to the pain and loss and hopelessness. But James Whitfield was smarter than that. Death would be mercy, and he wasn't feeling merciful. "No," he said slowly. "I'm not going to kill you, Sarah. I'm going to make you an example. I'm going to make sure every slave on this plantation understands what happens to those who defy me." He ordered me tied to the whipping post again. But this time, he didn't delegate. This time, James Whitfield picked up the whip himself. The beating was the worst I would ever receive. He struck me 75 times, counting each stroke aloud, taking his time, making sure each one cut deep. He was strong for a fat man, and he put his full weight behind every strike. By stroke 20, I was screaming. By stroke 40, I was begging. By stroke 60, I was beyond words, just animal sound of agony. By stroke 75, I was barely conscious, hanging from the restraints, my back a mass of torn flesh and blood. But as he raised the whip for the final strikes, something happened. Something shifted inside me. The pain became distant, secondary, and through the fog of agony, I saw clearly. I saw James Whitfield, breathing hard from exertion, face red with effort and rage. I saw him as he truly was, not some powerful master, but a weak man who needed violence to feel strong, who needed to hurt others to feel superior. I saw him, and I felt something that surprised me. Pity, and underneath the pity, something harder. Determination. Purpose. A promise forming in my mind with absolute clarity. When he finally finished, when he stepped back to admire his work, I raised my head. Blood dripped from my mouth. My back was destroyed. But I met his eyes and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. "I'm going to bury you, James Whitfield." He stared at me, shocked that I could still speak. "I'm going to be free," I continued, my voice growing stronger despite the pain. "And you're going to be dead, and I'm going to dance on your grave. This is my promise. I'm going to bury you." The enslaved people watching gasped. Threatening a white man was a death sentence, especially a promise like that, spoken publicly and unambiguously. James Whitfield laughed, but it sounded forced. "You're delirious from the beating. You'll die on this plantation. Sarah, you'll never escape. You'll never be free. And you'll certainly never outlive me." "Watch me," I whispered, and then consciousness left me. They carried me back to the quarters and left me to die. But I didn't die. I hung on, fever-racked and bleeding, tended by other enslaved women who whispered among themselves about my promise, about whether I was crazy or cursed or blessed with some knowledge they couldn't understand. It took 3 weeks before I could walk, another month before I could work. But I survived, and every day I survived, I thought about my promise. I thought about James Whitfield dead and buried, and me dancing on his grave. The image sustained me through the pain, through the grief of losing Daniel, through the endless days of bondage. I would escape again. And next time, I wouldn't fail. Next time, I would be free. And then, somehow, some way, I would make my promise come true. I want to thank you for staying with this story. I know Sarah's journey has been difficult to witness, filled with unimaginable pain and loss. But I promise you, what's coming next will show you the true power of human determination and the unexpected ways that justice can manifest. The best part of the story is still ahead. The months following my second failed escape were the darkest of my life. December 1856 came and went. January 1857 arrived cold and bitter. I worked mechanically, healed slowly, and thought constantly about Daniel. Where was he? Was he being treated well? Did he remember me? Was he even alive? I got my answer on February 14th, 1857. Valentine's Day, a cruel joke from a universe with a sense of irony. A slave from a neighboring plantation came to Riverside to deliver some equipment. During the transaction, he saw me and approached cautiously. "You're Sarah Matthews? You had a son named Daniel?" My heart stopped. "Yes." "Do you know where he is? Have you seen him?" His face told me everything before he spoke. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I heard from a trader passing through. Your boy, he died. Yellow fever outbreak in Mississippi. Took a lot of the young ones. I'm real sorry." The world tilted. I heard the words but couldn't process them. Daniel, dead. My 10-year-old son, who I'd promised to find, who I'd promised to save, dead on some plantation in Mississippi, alone and far from everyone who loved him. I don't remember much of the next few hours. I know I collapsed. I know other enslaved people tried to comfort me. I know I screamed until my voice was gone. But the details are foggy, lost in a grief so profound that it threatened to consume me entirely. James Whitfield heard about it, of course. He probably took satisfaction in it, in the knowledge that he'd succeeded in taking my son from me permanently. But he said nothing to me directly. Just watched me with those cold eyes as I moved through the following days like a ghost. Something died in me with Daniel. Not my anger, that remained, burning hotter than ever, but some last trace of fear died. What could they do to me now that was worse than what had already been done? Kill me? That would be mercy. Beat me? My body was already broken. Take my loved ones? They already had. Without fear, I became dangerous. Not physically dangerous. I was still enslaved, still relatively powerless, but mentally dangerous, psychologically dangerous. I had nothing left to lose, and people with nothing to lose are the most dangerous people alive. On March 1st, 1857, I made a mistake, not out of carelessness or defiance, but out of simple exhaustion and grief. I was carrying breakfast to the dining room, and I dropped the tray. Not expensive porcelain this time, just simple plates and cups, but the crash brought James Whitfield running. He took one look at the spilled food and broken dishes, then at me, and I saw something in his face that scared me for the first time in weeks. Not anger, that would have been familiar, but calculation. He was realizing what I'd become, this fearless, grief-destroyed woman who had nothing left to take, and he was realizing that made me dangerous. "Sarah," he said quietly, "you're becoming a problem. You're setting a bad example. The other slaves are starting to think you're some kind of martyr, some kind of symbol of resistance. That can't continue." I said nothing, just looked at him with dead eyes. "I think it's time for another lesson," he continued, "a public one, to remind everyone what happens to those who think they're special, who think they can defy the natural order." He called for an assembly. Every enslaved person on Riverside was summoned to the yard behind the big house. It was a cold morning, frost still on the ground, our breath visible in the air. 200 people, knowing what was coming, powerless to stop it. James Whitfield stood on the porch and addressed the crowd. "Some of you have been whispering about Sarah Matthews, about her escapes, her punishments, her promise to outlive me." He laughed. "I'm going to show you how empty that promise is. I'm going to show you that no slave, no matter how defiant, can challenge a master and win." They tied me to the whipping post for the third time, but this time felt different. The previous beatings had been about punishment, about pain. This one was about breaking my spirit completely, about destroying any hope of resistance. James Whitfield ordered 100 lashes. 100, an amount that would kill most people, that would certainly leave me permanently crippled if I survived at all. He handed the whip to his most brutal overseer, a man named Clayton who enjoyed causing pain, who took pride in his ability to flay flesh from bone with precise strokes. "Do not hold back," James instructed. "I want her broken, completely and permanently broken." Clayton smiled and raised a whip. The first strike was the worst of my life. The second made the first seem mild. By the 10th, I was screaming in a voice I didn't recognize as my own. By the 20th, I was begging incoherently. By the 30th, I was praying for death. But somewhere around the 40th strike, something strange happened. The pain didn't lessen. If anything, it intensified. But I became separate from it, as if I was floating above my body, watching this punishment happen to someone else. And in that detached state, clarity came. I saw my life laid out before me like a map. I saw the past, filled with suffering and loss. I saw the present, this moment of agony. And I saw the future, multiple possible futures branching out like roads. In one future, I died here at this whipping post, destroyed by James Whitfield's rage. In another, I survived but remained enslaved until death, broken and hopeless. But in a third future, a future that seemed impossible but somehow felt inevitable, I was free. And James Whitfield was dead. and I was dancing on his grave, just as I had promised. That third future called to me with such force that I felt it like a physical pull. And in that moment, hanging half-conscious from the whipping post, my back being systematically destroyed, I made a choice. I chose that third future. I committed to it with every fiber of my being. At stroke 75, with 25 more to come, I raised my head. Blood streamed down my face. My vision was blurry, but I could see James Whitfield watching from the porch, could see the satisfaction in his face as he thought he was finally breaking me. And I spoke. Not loudly. I didn't have the strength for that. But clearly enough that people nearby heard, and they would spread the words to others. I'm going to bury you, James Whitfield. The same promise I had made months ago, but with new weight, new certainty. I'm going to be free. You're going to be dead. And I'm going to dance on your grave. This is my sacred promise. I'm going to bury you. James heard me. His face went red with rage, but also with something else. Fear, because despite the whip, despite the blood, despite the absolute power he supposedly held over me, he heard something in my voice that scared him. Certainty. Absolute, unshakable certainty. You're insane, he shouted. You're going to die here, Sarah. You'll never escape. You'll never be free. And you'll certainly never outlive me. I'm 46 years old and healthy. You're a slave who can barely stand. Your promise is empty. Watch me, I whispered, just as I had before. Clayton continued the beating. 76, 77. Each strike a line of fire across my ruined back. But I didn't scream anymore. I just counted. 78, 79. Each number another step toward my future, toward that impossible third path where I was free and he was dead. At stroke 100, Clayton finally stopped. My back was destroyed, flesh hanging in ribbons, bone visible through the wounds. Medical knowledge at the time said I wouldn't survive. The enslaved people watching expected me to die within days. They cut me down and I felt like a corpse. But I was still conscious, still breathing, still holding on to that vision of the future. As they carried me away, I heard James Whitfield speaking to his wife. She won't last a week. Problem solved. We'll find a replacement for the housework. But I did last a week, and the next week, and the month after that. Against all odds, against medical impossibility, I survived. My back healed into a mass of scar tissue that would never look human again. But I survived. And as I healed, lying on my pallet in the quarters, I planned. Not another escape. Not yet. The previous 2 attempts had taught me that running without preparation was suicide. If I was going to escape again, if I was going to fulfill my promise, I needed to be smarter. I needed information. Maps. Safe houses. Contacts. I needed to understand the Underground Railroad, the network of abolitionists and freed people who helped escapees reach the North. I needed money, though I didn't know how an enslaved person could acquire money. I needed skills beyond domestic work, skills that would let me survive in freedom. Most importantly, I needed patience. That's what had defeated me before, desperation and haste. This time, I would wait, I would plan, I would prepare, and when I finally made my third escape, it would be successful. My promise to James Whitfield wasn't empty rage or delusional hope. It was a plan, a purpose, a reason to survive each day. I would bury him. Somehow, some way, I would see him dead, and I would be free to celebrate it. The promise sustained me through the rest of March, through April and May. It gave me strength when the pain of my healing back made me want to die. It gave me focus when grief for Daniel threatened to overwhelm me. It gave me a future when the present was unbearable. And slowly, carefully, I began to lay the groundwork for my third escape. The one that would succeed, the one that would lead me to freedom and, eventually, to the fulfillment of the most impossible promise a slave ever made to her master. I swore to bury James Whitfield, and I meant every word. It took me 9 months to prepare for my third escape. 9 months of careful planning, of gathering information, of building resources, of becoming invisible again so James Whitfield would stop watching me so closely. By December 1857, I was ready. During those 9 months, I'd learned things that should have been impossible for an enslaved person to learn. I'd discovered which enslaved people on neighboring plantations had connections to the Underground Railroad. I'd found a free black man in Savannah who, for a price I paid in stolen silver spoons, would provide forged freedom papers. I'd memorized routes in safe houses and code words. I'd stolen and hidden small amounts of money. Pennies and nickels taken from coat pockets when I cleaned them added up over months. Most importantly, I'd transformed myself mentally. I was no longer Sarah Matthews, enslaved domestic servant on Riverside Plantation. I was Sarah Freeman, soon to be a free woman. I thought like a free person, planned like a free person, prepared for a free person's life. On December 23rd, 1857, I made my move. Christmas was approaching, and the plantation was in holiday preparation chaos. James and Catherine Whitfield were hosting an elaborate party on Christmas Eve, with guests from Savannah staying at the house. The confusion of preparation and entertaining provided perfect cover. I waited until the party was in full swing. The house was full of white people eating and drinking and celebrating, completely focused on their festivities. The enslaved people serving them were busy, distracted. The overseers were drunk. At midnight, I slipped away from the kitchen where I'd been washing dishes. I'd already hidden my escape pack in the woods beyond the quarters. The forged freedom papers identify me as Sarah Freeman, a freed woman from Charleston. A change of clothes that looked more respectable than my work dress. Food, money, a knife. I walked away from Riverside Plantation like I was simply going to the quarters. But instead of turning toward the cabins, I kept walking into the woods, away from everything I'd known for 9 years. This time, I didn't run. Running attracted attention. Instead, I walked with purpose, like a free black woman going about her business. I'd learned that confidence was armor. People who looked like they belonged somewhere rarely got questioned. I walked all night, reaching Savannah by dawn. The city was waking up, merchants opening shops, people beginning their day. I found the address I'd memorized, a small shop run by a free black man named Abraham Johnson, who was secretly part of the Underground Railroad. I knocked on the back door, gave the code phrase I'd learned, and was led inside by a suspicious Abraham who looked me over carefully. "You're running." "I'm free," I corrected, showing him my forged papers. "I'm Sarah Freeman from Charleston, and I'm traveling to Philadelphia to stay with family." He examined the papers, nodded slowly. "These are good forgeries. Where'd you get them? Does it matter?" He smiled slightly. "I suppose not. You need help getting north?" "Yes, and I need information about someone who might help me once I'm there." Over the next week, Abraham Johnson taught me things that changed my life. He taught me how to read better. I'd learned basics, secretly over the years, but he improved my skills dramatically. He taught me about abolitionist organizations in Philadelphia. He told me about boarding houses that accepted black women. He gave me letters of introduction to people who would help me establish a new life. Most importantly, he told me about a woman named Rebecca Thornton who ran a private investigation service in Philadelphia, someone who helped formerly enslaved people track down lost family members and gather information about their former masters, someone who might help me find out what happened to Daniel, and someone who might help me learn everything about James Whitfield. I left Savannah on January 2nd, 1858, traveling north on the Underground Railroad. It was a network of safe houses and guides that moved escapees from station to station, hiding them during the day, moving them at night, always staying one step ahead of slave catchers. The journey took 2 months. 2 months of fear, of hiding in cellars and attics, of being moved in wagons hidden under false floors, of trusting strangers with my life. But I made it. On March 1st, 1858, I arrived in Philadelphia. I stood on Market Street, a free woman in a free city, and for the first time in my entire life, I belonged to myself. I found work immediately, domestic service, the only skill I had, but this time I was paid for it. Wages, money that was mine. I rented a room in a boarding house, small and simple, but mine. I walked the streets without fear, without needing permission, without worrying about patrols or slave catchers. Freedom was overwhelming and beautiful and terrifying all at once. Within a week, I found Rebecca Thornton's office, a small room above a printing shop where she conducted her investigations. Rebecca was a white woman in her 50s, a Quaker and abolitionist who'd been helping escaped slaves for 20 years. I told her my story, about Daniel, about James Whitfield, about my promise. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she nodded slowly. "I can help you," she said. "Finding information about your son will be difficult. Records of enslaved children are sparse, and if he died on a plantation in Mississippi, documentation might be non-existent. But I can try. As for James Whitfield, I can learn everything about him. His business dealings, his debts, his properties, his weaknesses. Information is power. Sarah, let me give you power." Over the next 3 years, from 1858 to 1860, Rebecca Thornton became my teacher and ally. She taught me how to investigate, how to gather information, how to use public records and court documents. She showed me James Whitfield's life laid bare, his cotton prices, his mortgage, his business partnerships, his drinking, his gambling debts. And I saw his vulnerability. James Whitfield looked powerful on his plantation, master of all he surveyed. But financially, he was struggling. Cotton prices had been falling for years. He'd made bad investments. He owed money to banks and creditors. His plantation was mortgaged heavily. He was one bad season away from ruin. During those 3 years, I also transformed myself. I studied. I learned to write eloquently. I learned mathematics and bookkeeping. I learned how the banking system worked, how mortgages and loans and debts functioned. I learned the law regarding property and inheritance and slave ownership. I became educated in ways that would have been impossible as an enslaved person, and I used that education to plan. I also worked with the Underground Railroad, helping other escapees the way I'd been helped. I guided people from safe house to safe house. I provided money and forged papers. I became part of the network that was slowly, steadily, bleeding the South of its enslaved population. And I thought constantly about my promise, about James Whitfield dead and buried, about me dancing on his grave, about justice. By 1860, I had money saved, 3 years of wages carefully hoarded. I had skills and knowledge. I had connections and allies. And I had information about James Whitfield's vulnerabilities. It was time to return to the South, not as an escaped slave, but as something else entirely, as a free woman of color with forged documents, saying I'd been born free in Louisiana, as someone who could move through Southern society without raising immediate suspicion, as someone who could destroy James Whitfield from within his own world. Rebecca Thornton helped me prepare. We created a complete false identity. Sarah Freeman, born free in New Orleans, educated in a Catholic school, trained in plantation management by her father, who'd been a free person of color, who worked as an overseer. The documents were perfect, complete with baptismal records and letters of reference. "Are you sure about this?" Rebecca asked when everything was ready. "Going back to Georgia is dangerous. If anyone recognizes you, if your disguise fails, you'll be re-enslaved immediately, or killed." "I'm sure," I said. "I made a promise. I'm going to keep it." Revenge is a dangerous motivation, Sarah. It can consume you. "This isn't just revenge," I replied. "This is justice. James Whitfield took my son from me. He beat me nearly to death 3 times. He enslaved me and hundreds of others. He deserves to pay for that, and I'm going to make him pay." Rebecca nodded slowly. "Then go, and may God grant you the justice you seek." In October 1860, I returned to Georgia, not to Riverside, that would be too dangerous, but to Savannah, where I established myself as Sarah Freeman, a free woman of color looking to invest in plantation properties on behalf of wealthy northern investors. The disguise was perfect. I dressed well, spoke eloquently, carried documents that established my bona fides. White Southerners were used to free people of color in port cities, especially those involved in business. I was unusual, but not impossible. Suspicious, but not obviously fake. And I began to investigate James Whitfield in person, gathering information about his finances, his properties, his debts, preparing for the moment when I would strike. The Civil War was coming. Everyone could feel it. Abraham Lincoln would be elected president in a month. Southern states were threatening secession. The entire system of slavery was teetering on the edge of collapse. But I couldn't wait for the war to destroy James Whitfield. I needed to do it myself. Personal, direct, fulfilling the promise I'd made while hanging from a whipping post 3 years earlier. I spent 6 months in Savannah, building my cover, establishing connections, learning everything about James Whitfield's business operations. And then, in April 1861, the same month the Civil War began at Fort Sumter, I made my move. I approached James Whitfield's largest creditor, a bank in Savannah that held a mortgage on Riverside Plantation. Using money I had carefully saved and borrowed, I purchased that mortgage. It took every resource I had, every favor I could call in, every alliance I'd built. But I did it. I now owned James Whitfield's debt, which meant I had power over him, which meant I could destroy him. It was time to fulfill my promise. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. I served mine frozen, calculated, and absolutely devastating. By May 1861, I owned a mortgage on Riverside Plantation, which meant I had the legal power to call in James Whitfield's debt and force him to pay immediately or face foreclosure. But I didn't want simple foreclosure. I wanted to watch him realize what was happening. I wanted him to know who was destroying him. I wanted him to understand that the enslaved woman he'd beaten nearly to death was now the person who held his entire life in her hands. So I arranged a meeting. On May 15th, 1861, James Whitfield came to Savannah to meet with his creditors. He arrived at the bank looking every one of his 51 years, his face puffy from drinking, his body soft from plantation luxury. The war had started, and he was worried about his finances, about maintaining his lifestyle in uncertain times. He was shown into a meeting room where I waited, dressed in a fine dress that probably cost more than he'd ever paid for me, my hair styled, my bearing confident. I was Sarah Freeman, successful businesswoman from New Orleans, and I looked nothing like the broken, bloodied slave he'd last seen in 1857. Mr. Whitfield, I greeted him professionally. Thank you for meeting with me. I'm Sarah Freeman. I represent the interests that now hold your mortgage. He looked at me with barely concealed disdain. Free blacks made him uncomfortable, especially those who acted like equals. I was told my meeting was with the bank president. The bank has sold your mortgage to private investors. I represent those investors, and we have concerns about your ability to repay. My plantation is one of the most productive in Georgia, he blustered. I've always made my payments. You've made minimum payments, Mr. Whitfield, but your actual debt has increased every year. Cotton prices are falling. The war is disrupting trade. Your expenses exceed your income. Frankly, you're overextended and headed for bankruptcy. His face reddened. I don't need a colored woman telling me about my finances. I smiled, cold and sharp. Unfortunately for you, this colored woman controls your mortgage, and she's calling in your debt. You have 90 days to pay the full amount, $12,000, or face foreclosure. He stood abruptly. You can't do that. I have rights. I have contracts, which you should read more carefully. The terms clearly state that the debt holder can call the loan at any time if they have concerns about repayment ability. And I have significant concerns. 90 days, Mr. Whitfield. Fine $12,000 or lose Riverside. He stormed out, cursing, promising to fight this, to find lawyers, to contact his political connections. But I knew he couldn't. I'd studied his finances for years. He didn't have $12,000. He couldn't borrow it. No one would loan to someone already that overextended. He had 90 days to save a plantation. He couldn't save, and I was going to watch him try. Over the next 3 months, I orchestrated James Whitfield's destruction with precision. I contacted his business partners and shared information about his debts, causing them to demand immediate payment on smaller loans. I spread rumors about Riverside's financial instability, making it impossible for him to find new investors. I ensured that every door he tried to open, every possible escape route was blocked. He tried selling enslaved people to raise money. I made sure potential buyers knew they were mortgage property that I could reclaim. He tried selling land. I arranged for the only interested buyers to make insultingly low offers. He tried gambling to win money. I made sure he lost. I became his shadow, his nemesis, the invisible hand destroying his life piece by piece. And he had no idea that Sarah Freeman, the free woman of color who was ruining him, was actually Sarah Matthews, the enslaved woman he'd promised would never escape, would never outlive him, would never fulfill her promise. By August 1861, James Whitfield was desperate. He'd fired most of his enslaved workers, unable to feed them. He'd sold everything of value in his house. He'd borrowed from every possible source. And he was still $8,000 short of what he needed to save Riverside. On August 14, 1861, the 90-day deadline arrived. James Whitfield couldn't pay. I foreclosed on Riverside Plantation. The property, the land, the buildings, the remaining enslaved people, all of it went to auction to satisfy the debt. And at that auction, using borrowed money and calling in every favor, I purchased Riverside Plantation. I became the owner of the property where I'd been enslaved, the plantation where I'd been beaten 3 times, the place where James Whitfield had destroyed my life. Now it was mine. James Whitfield attended the auction, watched as Sarah Freeman purchased his family's plantation, and he had no idea who I really was. He just saw a successful free black woman taking his property, adding insult to his injury. After the auction, as he stood in shock, I approached him. "Mr. Whitfield, I'm sorry about your losses. I know how difficult this must be." He looked at me with pure hatred. "You've destroyed me. You and your northern investors. You've taken everything I had." "Not everything," I said quietly. "You still have your life. Though I imagine living without Riverside will be quite different from what you're used to." "Who are you?" he asked suddenly, suspicion in his eyes. "Why target me specifically? This wasn't just business. This was personal." I smiled. "Why would it be personal, Mr. Whitfield? I'm just a businesswoman who saw an opportunity. Although," I paused, "I did hear you once owned a slave woman named Sarah Matthews. Whatever happened to her?" His eyes widened. Just for a moment, he looked at me, really looked, and I saw recognition beginning to dawn. But it was impossible. Sarah Matthews was enslaved, illiterate, broken. This woman was free, educated, powerful. They couldn't be the same person. "She escaped," he said slowly. "Years ago. Probably dead by now." "Probably," I agreed. "Well, Mr. Whitfield, I wish you luck in your future endeavors. I'm sure you'll land on your feet." He didn't. James Whitfield moved to a boarding house in Savannah, taking odd jobs, drinking heavily. His reputation destroyed, his fortune gone. He lasted 18 months. On February 16, 1862, James Whitfield died of cirrhosis of the liver in a charity hospital, alone and penniless. He was 52 years old. I heard about his death 3 days later. There was no family to claim his body. Catherine had divorced him and moved north. His children wanted nothing to do with his shame. He was buried in a pauper's grave in Savannah's public cemetery, with no marker, no ceremony, no one to mourn him, except me. On February 20th, 1862, I went to that cemetery. I found a fresh grave with no name, just a wooden marker with a number. I stood over a mound of dirt that covered James Whitfield's body, and I remembered my promise. I remembered the first beating, the broken porcelain, and the 20 lashes. I remembered the second beating, losing Daniel and the 50 lashes. I remembered the third beating, the 100 lashes, and the promise I'd made while dying. "I'm going to bury you, James Whitfield. I'm going to be free and you're going to be dead, and I'm going to dance on your grave." I'd fulfilled that promise. I was free. He was dead. And now, standing over his pauper's grave with no one watching, I began to dance. It wasn't graceful. I was 34 years old with a back destroyed by whips, and I'd never learned to dance properly. But I moved, I swayed, I celebrated. I danced on James Whitfield's grave exactly as I promised I would. And then I wept, not for him, never for him, but for Daniel, for the years lost of slavery, for the woman I'd been and the woman I'd become, for the cost of my promise, the price of my freedom, the weight of my revenge. When I finished, I was empty. The rage that had sustained me for 5 years was gone, burned away in fulfillment of my oath. James Whitfield was dead, destroyed by the woman he thought he'd broken. Justice had been served, though not through the law or through violence, but through intelligence, determination, and the systematic dismantling of everything he valued. I returned to Riverside Plantation, which was now legally mine, and I began the second phase of my promise, the part I'd never spoken aloud, but had always intended. I freed every enslaved person on the property. All 43 people who remained when I took ownership received manumission papers declaring them free. I gave them the choice to stay and work for wages or leave and seek opportunities elsewhere. Most stayed. They had nowhere else to go, no resources to travel with. So I employed them, paid them fairly, and together we transformed Riverside from plantation into a school. The Sarah Matthews Freeman School for Freedmen opened in March 1862. It educated formerly enslaved children and adults, teaching reading, writing, mathematics, history. We used the big house as classrooms. We turned the slave quarters into dormitories for boarding students. We created gardens that fed everyone working there. We took the place that had represented suffering and bondage and transformed it into a place of education and freedom. We took James Whitfield's legacy and made it serve justice instead of oppression. The school operated for 8 years, until 1870, educating over 300 people before funding difficulties forced us to close. But the impact lasted forever. Students from that school became teachers, business people, political leaders during Reconstruction. They spread across Georgia and beyond, carrying with them the education they received at the place where I'd once been enslaved, where I'd been beaten nearly to death, where I'd made my promise. My promise to bury James Whitfield hadn't been about simple revenge. It had been about transformation, about turning suffering into justice, about using the very systems that had oppressed me to free others, about ensuring that my pain served a purpose beyond just evening scores. I buried James Whitfield, but I didn't just dance on his grave. I built a better world on the ruins of his legacy. I lived to be 73 years old, long enough to see slavery abolished, to see Reconstruction transform the South, to see formerly enslaved people becoming citizens with rights and voices, long enough to see some of my students from the Freeman School become state legislators and business people and teachers themselves. But I want to tell you about the day in 1869 when the true meaning of my promise became clear to me, the day I finally understood what I'd actually accomplished. I was 61 years old, still running the Freeman School, though my body was failing. My back had never healed properly from those beatings. I walked with a cane, moved slowly, lived with constant pain. The scars were permanent, both physical and psychological. A young man came to visit me in November 1869. He was about 23 years old, well-dressed, educated, with an air of confidence that immediately reminded me of someone, though I couldn't place who. "Mrs. Freeman," he said, "my name is Thomas Whitfield. I believe you knew my father." My heart stopped. James Whitfield's son. Here, in front of me. I prepared myself for accusations, for anger, for demands that I explained how I destroyed his family. But Thomas Whitfield smiled, and it was gentle, not hostile. "I came to thank you." "Thank me?" I was confused. "For destroying my father," he said simply. "For freeing me from his legacy." He sat down and told me his story. James Whitfield had been a cruel father, as well as a cruel master. He'd beaten Thomas and his siblings, had controlled every aspect of their lives, had been a tyrant in his own home. When James lost Riverside, when his reputation collapsed, when he died alone and penniless, Thomas had felt relief. "You saved me from becoming him," Thomas said. "If he'd succeeded, if he'd kept the plantation, the power, I would have inherited all of that. I would have become a slave owner, a man who treated human beings as property. I would have become my father." He paused. "Instead, I grew up seeing his fall, seeing that cruelty and oppression don't lead to lasting power, that treating people as less than human eventually destroys you. I became a teacher instead, working with the Freedmen's Bureau to educate former slaves. I became the opposite of my father because you showed me what happens to men like him. I sat in silence, processing this. James Whitfield's son thanking me for destroying his father, finding liberation in his father's fall. Did your father ever figure out who I was? I asked, did he ever realize Sarah Freeman was Sarah Matthews? Thomas shook his head. I don't think so. He died thinking you were just an ambitious businesswoman who'd outmaneuvered him. He never knew you were the slave he'd beaten nearly to death. He never understood that his own victim had orchestrated his destruction. Good, I said. Let him die ignorant. Let him never know that the woman he thought he'd broken was the one who buried him. Thomas stayed for several hours. We talked about his father, about Riverside, about the school I created, and before he left, he said something that changed how I understood my entire journey. Mrs. Freeman, you made a promise to bury my father, but you did more than that. You buried everything he stood for, the cruelty, the oppression, the system that allowed men like him to exist. You took his plantation and turned it into a school. You took the place where people were enslaved and made it a place where people learned to be free. That's a greater revenge than just his death. That's generational justice. After he left, I sat alone in my office and thought about what he'd said, about promises and justice and revenge and transformation. I'd spent 5 years obsessed with my promise to bury James Whitfield, 5 years of planning and plotting, and working toward a moment when I could destroy him. And I'd succeeded. I'd buried him, both literally and figuratively. But the real accomplishment wasn't his death. It was what I'd built after his death. The school that educated 300 people, the enslaved people I'd freed, the example I'd set that revenge doesn't have to be violent, that justice can be creative, that transformation is more powerful than destruction. James Whitfield died alone and forgotten. But Sarah Matthews Freeman lived on in every student who learned to read at the school named after her, in every person who escaped slavery through the Underground Railroad with her help, in every formerly enslaved person who saw her story and realized that they too could overcome, could transform, could build something better from their suffering. I closed the school in 1870, unable to keep it running without adequate funding. But I didn't stop working. I wrote about my experiences, documenting the 3 beatings, the 3 escapes, the promise and its fulfillment. I wanted people to know that enslaved people weren't passive victims, that we fought back in whatever ways we could, that we were human beings with agency and power even when the law said we were property. My memoirs were published in 1872, titled 3 Beatings, 3 Escapes, 1 Promise, the story of Sarah Matthews Freeman. They were controversial. Some people thought I was too harsh on James Whitfield, that revenge wasn't Christian, that I should have forgiven him. But I had no regrets. James Whitfield deserved everything that happened to him. He'd enslaved human beings, separated families, beaten people nearly to death, and felt no remorse. His destruction was justice, not revenge. His death was the natural consequence of a life built on cruelty. And my promise, I'm going to bury you, had been fulfilled in ways I couldn't have imagined when I first spoke those words while hanging from a whipping post. I buried James Whitfield, but I also buried the system he represented. I helped bury slavery itself by freeing people, by educating people, by showing that enslaved people could be smarter and stronger and more moral than their masters. I danced on his grave, but I also danced on the grave of the institution that had given him power over me. I celebrated not just his death, but the death of everything he stood for. I died on March 3rd, 1880, in Philadelphia, surrounded by former students and friends. My last words, according to those present, were, I kept my promise. They buried me in Eden Cemetery, and my tombstone reads, Sarah Matthews Freeman, 1828 to 1880, born enslaved, died free. She made a promise and buried her master. She built a school on his plantation. She transformed suffering into justice. She kept her promise. My story didn't end with my death. It lived on in the people I'd taught, the people I'd freed, the people I'd inspired. Thomas Whitfield, James's son, included my story in his own memoirs about growing up with a cruel father and finding redemption through education. Students from the Freeman School spread across America, carrying with them the lessons they'd learned. And my promise, that simple, impossible promise made by a dying slave woman to her master, became legendary. It was repeated in slave quarters, whispered as encouragement to people who thought they had no power, told as a reminder that even the most oppressed people can find ways to strike back. I'm going to bury you. 3 beatings couldn't stop those words. 3 escape attempts couldn't invalidate them. 5 years of planning couldn't diminish them. And ultimately, the promise came true in ways more powerful and complete than simple murder could ever have achieved. This is the story of Sarah Matthews Freeman, enslaved for 28 years, beaten 3 times, escaped 3 times, made a promise that everyone said was impossible, and fulfilled it absolutely. I buried James Whitfield, but more importantly, I buried the ideology that allowed him to exist. I took suffering and transformed it into freedom. I took pain and transformed it into education. I took a promise made in agony and transformed it into justice that lasted generations. That's the true meaning of my story. Not that I got revenge on my oppressor, though I did, but that I took the absolute worst thing that could happen to a human being, enslavement and torture and loss, and I transformed it into something beautiful and liberating. James Whitfield thought he was powerful. He thought he could break me. He thought his position as a white master made him invincible. He was wrong about all of it. I was the powerful one. I was the one who couldn't be broken. I was the one who proved invincible. And I'm the one history remembers, while he's forgotten, except as a villain in my story. I made a promise. I kept it. And in keeping it, I changed the world. This is an extraordinary true story of Sarah Matthews Freeman, who promised to bury her master, and did exactly that, but in ways more profound than anyone could have imagined. What do you think about Sarah's journey? Was her revenge justified? Would you have made the same choices? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently about resilience and justice, please subscribe to our channel. We bring you hidden stories from history that deserve to be remembered. Stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. And don't stop here. Click on the next recommended video to discover another incredible story of survival, determination, and triumph against impossible odds. These stories need to be told, and we need you to help us tell them. Subscribe now, leave your comments, and join us in preserving these powerful narratives that show the true strength of the human spirit.